Welcome to Task 14, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde. In this section, we will be looking at when Mr Utterson finally meets Mr Hyde. This can be found on pages 21 to 22 of your workbook. Before we start looking at the extract, I'm going to do a quick recap about what has just happened. Mr Utterson, prompted by a conversation with Mr Enfield, decides to return home to study the will that he had drawn up with Dr. Jekyll. The will states that upon the death or disappearance of Dr. Jekyll, that all his property will be given to Mr. Hyde. Utterson is concerned that Hyde has some power over Jekyll and decides to go to speak to Dr. Lanyon, a friend of Dr. Jekyll's. Dr. Lanyon tells Utterson that him and Jekyll have had a professional dispute and that he has never heard of Mr. Hyde. Utterson is haunted by nightmares and begins to spend time around the building where Enfield previously saw Hyde. We shall now begin by reading the extract. Mr. Utterson stepped out and touched him on the shoulder as he passed. Mr. Hyde, I think. Mr. Hyde shrank back with a hissing intake of breath. But his fear was only momentary, and though he did not look the lawyer in the face, he answered coolly enough. "That is my name. What do you want?" "I see you are going in," returned the lawyer. "I am an old friend of Dr. Jekyll's, Mr. Utterson of Gaunt Street. You must have heard of my name, and meeting you so conveniently, I thought you might admit me." "You will not find Dr. Jekyll. He is from home," replied Mr. Hyde, blowing in the key, and then suddenly, but still without looking up, "How did you know me?" he asked. "On your side," said Mr. Utterson. "Will you do me a favour?" "With pleasure," replied the other. "What shall it be?" "Will you let me see your face?" asked the lawyer. Mr. Hyde appeared to hesitate, and then, as if upon some sudden reflection, fronted about with an air of defiance, and the pair stared at each other pretty fixedly for a few seconds. "Now I shall know you again," said Mr. Utterson. "It may be useful." "Yes," returned Mr. Hyde, "it is as well we have met, and a propos you should have my address," and he gave a number of a street in Soho. "Good God!" thought Mr. Utterson. "Can he too have been thinking of the will?" But he kept his feelings to himself, and only grunted in acknowledgment of the address. "And now," said the other, "how did you know me?" "By description," was the reply. "Whose description?" "We have common friends," said Mr. Utterson. "Common friends?" echoed Mr. Hyde, a little hoarsely. "Who are they?" "Jekyll, for instance," said the lawyer. "He never told you!" cried Mr. Hyde, with a flush of anger. "I did not think you would have lied." "Come," said Mr. Utterson, "that is not fitting language." The other snarled aloud into a savage laugh, and the next moment, with extraordinary quickness, he had unlocked the door and disappeared into the house. The lawyer stood a while when Mr. Hyde had left him, the picture of disquietude. Then he began slowly to mount the street, pausing every step or two and putting his hand to his brow, like a man in mental perplexity. The problem he was thus debating as he walked was one of a class that is rarely solved. Mr. Hyde was pale and dwarfish. He gave an impression of deformity without any nameable malformations. He had a displeasing smile. He had borne himself to the lawyer with a sort of murderous mixture of timidity and boldness, and he spoke with a husky, whispering, and somewhat broken voice. All these were points against him, but not all of these together could explain the hitherto unknown disgust, loathing, and fear with which Mr. Utterson regarded him. "There must be something else," said the perplexed gentleman. "There is something more. If I could find a name for it. God bless me, the man seems hardly human. Something troglodytic, shall we say? Or can it be the story of Dr. Fell?" or is it the mere radiance of a foul soul that thus transpires through, and transfigures its clay continent? The last, I think. For oh, my poor old Harry Jekyll, if ever I read Satan's signature upon a face, it is on that of your new friend. The first question asks us to consider how Hyde is described as a disturbing character. As you'll see as we've read through the abstract, I have highlighted some of these key points, and we're going to go through and discuss each of them now in some detail. The first point I've highlighted is when Hyde shrank back with a hissing intake of the breath. This quotation depicts Hyde as being inhuman and instead animalistic, in that he is hissing, which is something we would normally associate with an animal such as a snake. In literature, snakes are generally considered creatures which are associated with evil and something sinister, and this therefore makes us as the reader wary of Hyde and what he might do. Another quotation I have picked out is that other snarled aloud into a savage laugh. Firstly, it's interesting the way Stevenson has decided to refer to Hyde as other, as opposed to referring to him by name. By doing this, we immediately see Hyde as more of an outsider and not one of them, as this idea is reiterated throughout this extract. In this section, we also have Hyde, who is seen as snarling, as he snarled towards Utterson. This gives us the impression of an aggressive animal who's baring his teeth in an attempt to warn Utterson off. Perhaps he feels that Utterson is somewhat of a threat to him and therefore is seen snarling. Furthermore, we have this idea of this savage laugh. What is implied by the use of the word savage here is that he comes across as someone cruel and uncontrollable in his demeanour and mannerisms. The next line I've highlighted is that of the extraordinary quickness we see as he disappears into the house. He seems to almost vanish and disappear before our eyes, and we're not really expecting this of Hyde. It's not what we would expect of this kind of gentleman of this era. Instead, we would be expecting him to invite Utterson in. Instead, he quickly disappears and flees, and this makes us even more wary of Hyde and what he's up to, and perhaps suggests that Hyde has something indeed to hide. Utterson also makes some references to Hyde's character, in which he uses the adjectives pale and dwarfish to describe him, and again referring back to that otherness, that he is not in keeping what we would expect of this kind of man. He comes across as someone different and irregular, and we could focus in perhaps on the use of the word pale there, suggesting that he's lacking in health. There's something not quite right with him. He's not quite right. Again, with his sort of stature being considered dwarfish, suggests that he's not perceived as part of the norm of society here. Again, the use of the word deformity helps to contribute towards the otherness. He's not quite in keeping for what we would expect of a man of this time. We also see a reference Utterson makes to Hyde's displeasing smile, which is quite an interesting one here, as we normally associate a smile with something that's quite positive. Yet by adding the adjective displeasing here, we see this smile of Hyde's being something called more sinister and a bit more uncomfortable. It seems to make Utterson feel uncomfortable, and we, the reader, feel a bit uncomfortable by it too. Later in this section, we also see that Utterson implicitly considers Hyde as hardly human, As you'll notice, as we've gone through the extract, we've discussed how he comes across as quite animalistic in that reference to that animal and that snake that we've already mentioned. Here he implicitly says that he is seen as something hardly human, which is then supported by this use of this word troglodytic here, which suggests someone who is prehistoric. So like a caveman, a cave dweller kind of character. Again, coming back to the idea that he is not part of our norm of society, is something quite otherness about Hyde. Lastly, I've pointed out this Satan signature, which is again contributing towards that time of otherness, but goes a little bit further to say that Hyde comes across as someone quite evil, because we look at Satan as sort of the Antichrist here, and he's not to be considered in a very positive light, which makes us feel that actually Hyde is not a particularly endearing character, and we are very wary of him. So that concludes the first question. Our second question asks us to consider what methods Stevenson has used to create a disturbing character. So some of the ideas that have been suggested here is you could consider Stevenson's use of adjectives, remembering that adjectives are used to describe a noun. So, for instance, one of the uses of the adjectives we could focus on would be the use of the savage laugh there. So focusing on the adjective savage to describe his laugh, and thinking about what the use of that word savage then, that adjective savage, implies in that instance, suggesting that, again, supporting that idea that we're seeing coming through of that otherness of Hyde. Similarly, you could look at and consider how he presents the semantic field of evil. So when we're referring to a semantic field here, we're looking at when a writer continues to reference a certain idea, and they might do that through the use of the words or the imagery they create. So when we're looking at this idea of evil here, some things that might support that idea of the evil semantic field might be the reference to this murderous mixture here, suggests that he is kind of not a very nice, not very pleasant, quite an evil kind of character. And you could also use the idea again of that Satan's signature, that he represents that Antichrist, that devil character, come here to do something not very pleasant. Yes. Then we could also focus on that religious connotations, that religious imagery that's in here. And as we're just talking about that Satan signature, that would be a good way of thinking about religious imagery here, in the fact that actually Satan's signature seems to suggest that Hyde represents our Antichrist, our Satan, our devil character, if you must. Lastly, we've got the zoomorphic images that we could talk about. Zoomorphic is when we're making reference to animal characters in it. So an example of which is when we see our Hyde character is hissing like snakes, and we've got that idea of the snarling, making him seem like a wolf or an animal. They would be examples of zoomorphic that have been used in the extract. We could also focus in on some alliteration. This is when we see the same letter or a sound repeated at the beginning of an adjacent word, or a word in close proximity. An example of that could be when we look at the sentence there, the hardly human. Here we're having that repetition of the H sound there. So that would be an example of alliteration. Lastly, you've got your sibilance that you could be looking out for. Sibilance is very similar to alliteration, but instead it's looking at the S sound at the beginning of the words there. So example of this could be our Satan signature. This repeats the S sound here, creating that kind of hissing kind of noise. Sibilance is often used to help reinforce the creepy tension, and that is definitely reaffirmed there in the use of the Satan signature to make that add that tense of creepiness towards Hyde's character. Anyway, hopefully some of that has been of some use for you. Thanks for listening.